Life, wisdom. I'm Psychetruth Correspondent Karina Rachel. Today on the Truth Talks, I'm joined by Dr. John Breeding, and we're going to talk about the public education system here in America. Before I get started, I want to ask you a question, and I hope you'll leave me a comment and let me know. Do you think that the American education system is dumbing people down? If you yourself went through public school, then you can let us know if you feel that it dumbed you down, but be sure to leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. Dr. Breeding, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So, as I mentioned, it's been said that the public education system here is dumbing people down. So, as a psychologist and as a professor, can you just let me know your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with that statement.
Okay.
The short answer. I think that I'm a big fan of John Taylor Gatto. He's my favorite educator, writer on public schools. He was in New York City and New York State Teacher of the Year, taught in the very poorest schools and the very richest schools, always got the best results. And that's why he was able to keep teaching for 30 years, even though he was unorthodox. And but what he had in common in teaching in these different schools, whether the very richest school districts or the very poorest, and getting good results, was he had what was called a guerrilla curriculum. And not like a gorilla like an ape, but like a guerrilla like a freedom fighter. Mm-hmm. And what that meant was that he mostly had the kids out of the schools. They mostly didn't go to school. They mostly spent their time in the communities, doing projects, doing apprenticeships, doing mentorships, doing research and investigation, that kind of thing. And it was based on the idea that, young people are natural learners, naturally curious and interested, naturally motivated to do things that are meaningful, naturally inclined that way out of their own self-directedness. So the idea is that, one, you trust in the natural intelligence of the kid. You don't have to make them smart. You trust in their natural desire to do things when they're allowed to follow their own inclinations and when they're recognized and acknowledged for that. And so it's this quality of self-determination, right? And in contrast to that, the schools are designed exactly to stop people from being self-determining. They're designed exactly to stop people from being independent producers and make them into agents or slaves or minions of other people who are producers. Mm-hmm. Meaning, in the time of the design of this system, that meant either the government authorities or the military authorities or the corporate authorities, the factory owners. 150 years ago, America was largely independent, self-producing craftsmen and farmers and that kind of thing. And it was as the Industrial Revolution was unfolding and the robber barons were setting up for this big expansion, and they needed people to move away from being independent and to move into a position of depending on them for jobs and stuff. So they needed to systematically break people from this independent spirit. And so the powers that be, and this is what Gatto lays out in his book, The Underground History of Modern American Education, which I highly recommend. But basically it was that the commissioners of education and the designers of this system that became the American public education system became the system that we now take for granted, right? It was designed specifically, when you read the documents, they'd say this overtly, it was designed to alienate people from their own soul. It was designed to create good factory workers and soldiers. And in fact, it was designed by the Prussians, which was Germany, and then adopted by the Americans, and then put in place as the foundation for what gradually became our compulsory education system.
Wow. So you're saying that quite literally, our current education system, as you mentioned, was designed to not maybe emphasize or encourage that independent, what you call self-determination, that idea of following your passions and your interests, but rather it's really designed to make workers, to make people who will be hardworking, but maybe aren't so in touch with their own personal passions and personal interests.
Right. When it's always useful to look at how a system or a structure is designed. And so, we take this design of our school system for granted because it's what we've known for 100 and something years. And we think that's how children learn and that's the way to set up a school, right? But when you look at how it's actually set up, what you see is that, for example, age segregation. Is age segregation done because that's the best way for children to learn? Is it human nature that you learn best when you're with a bunch of other people exactly your age? Do 5-year-olds learn best when they're segregated with other 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds with other 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds with other 7-year-olds? Well, the obvious fact when you look at young people in their lives, that's not true. You learn best by being with a whole range of ages. And children learn from older children. They learn by teaching younger children. The old sort of one-room schoolroom really was much more effective that way. So that's age segregation. Here's one more example. You have an age-segregated class of 30 or 40 or however many 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds, and then you have this one old person or older person who's the teacher, right? And all these desks are lined up. There's this one adult authority there who's the teacher, right? And what that does is it creates an intellectual and emotional dependency. The young people are trained to think that learning comes from this person, and what I need to learn is what they tell me I need to learn, and whether I learn it well or not is dependent on their approval, acknowledgement, gold star, whatever. And so it creates this intellectual and emotional dependency. The structure is set up exactly that no one is really allowed in a meaningful way to pursue what I want to pursue when I want to pursue it. So it systematically undermines that kind of self-directed learning.
Right. So that's really interesting. And I think that it's funny because I remember when I was in school, they always talked about critical thinking. And at the end of every chapter, there would be like the critical thinking exercises. But what you're actually saying is that the critical thinking, the actual thinking for yourself, is being discouraged. And we actually talked about that in a video it's called Not Trusting Authority, or learning to question authority. And I think it's really interesting that in the public school system, we see there is this authoritarian kind of effect where you have your teacher and they give the grades and everything is according to them. And I remember being in school, and even if you would ask them a question, it was really about what they thought was the case or what the book was saying. And, it really didn't encourage critical thinking. So what about standardized tests? That's another huge component of
Well, a couple
schooling.
of examples would be the use, just in an ongoing basis, would be the use of multiple choice tests, as opposed to something that's more free form as a way of expressing what you know, right? A multiple choice test is what Gatto calls a weapon of mass instruction. It sets up that there's a specific answer that this other person knows, and the way to do well is to get that answer, as opposed to coming forth with your own creative thinking, your own critical thinking, that kind of thing. So that's a tool that systematically undermines critical thinking and expanded thinking and synthetic thinking and all those things, On a sort of another level of looking at the system as a whole, what you see are these rhetorical words that politicians use to make actions to supposedly improve the education system, but really continue to undermine real learning. And the last Republican president had the thing called No Child Left Behind. The current Democratic president has a thing called Race to the Top, right? Both of those things are nice little phrases, that are really problematic, because No Child Left Behind really means dumbing us down, no one's allowed to move forward with their own initiative, Instead, there's this so-called high-stakes accountability testing, which is basically this dumbed-down set of information that everybody's supposed to know and be able to parrot back in a certain way on these tests, The Race to the Top thing is continues to emphasize high-stakes accountability testing to much too great an extent, but it also emphasizes, and this is really an obvious thing to me, but it's not very obvious when you're swimming in a sea that is based on the premise that competition is the best thing in the world. So you bring that competition right into the educational sphere, with the race to the top, and it subverts and undermines, really self-determination or self-directed learning, because by definition, if something's self-directed, it can't really be competitive in the sense that it's the emphasis of competition is my being better than you, right? It's not my being true to myself, because if I'm being true to myself and you're being true to yourself, competition's irrelevant.
Right.
I mean, we might have fun on the tennis court or something, but in terms of really expressing, what we're doing in terms of learning and producing and sharing our gifts with the world, it's irrelevant. So the whole thing of high-stakes accountability testing is a huge problem. Fortunately, a lot of people are challenging that conversation right now, but it's still dominant in terms of how the system is structured.
Right. And that's interesting that you talk about how the information, like you said, is instruments of mass instruction. That definitely kind of rings home for me. And I remember when I was in school, they used to call it regurgitating. Like you just had to regurgitate all the information onto the test. And I remember that I always preferred when there was an essay test and when I could actually show that I had, I can grasp this concept. I can even apply this concept out to other things. But the multiple choice tests, I would always score more poorly on because I would miss the questions or I couldn't remember the exact date, or they try to trick you. They kind of try to trick you in there. So you talked in one of your videos from the Leaving Home series about homeschool. And in the next video, I want to ask if you will talk a little bit more comparing homeschooling with public schooling. I think that's about all the time that we have for today. So thank you so much. I hope that you will like this video if you enjoyed it. I hope you'll stay tuned for our next video about homeschooling, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much for watching.